Welcome everybody to the F4 Hunger Awareness Show.
It's my goal to feed 1 billion people before I die.
We want to bring awareness around the issue of hunger and food insecurity.
7 to 8 million people served so far. With the sole goal of eradicating world hunger by connecting sources of food to recipients in need. Fiorenza's Food for Friends.
Hello, welcome to the F4 Hunger Awareness Show. I'm your host, Derek Fiorenza, and today we are going to be talking about hunger in Japan. I've been doing a lot of research this past week as part of our theme. It's a continuation. We're trying to create hunger awareness around America. So every state, we're going to be covering all the states, but we're also trying to cover hunger in different countries around the world. So I figured, why not go to Japan? So I did some research, and this will be released in conjunction with an article that I wrote about Japan. And the way I kind of approached it was looking at Japan through a historical lens. So some of the data, it goes back 130,000 years, dating back to the primitive prehistoric period in Japan. Some information that I found on the Japan Cultural Expo 2.0. It took us through essentially 10 different periods. I won't try to pronounce the different periods because I don't want to be disrespectful, but the modern present day period, Tokyo is the capital with a centralized state created by the new government. So what we'll talk about today is the key phrase Shoko no Hinken. Shoko no Hinken. That stands for food poverty. So that is Japan's sociological term for food poverty. So what is food poverty? What is food insecurity? What is hunger? So we'll dive into some of the hunger stats. According to the Japan Ministry of Health, Labor and Welfare, the relative poverty rate in Japan is just under 15.5%. That represents around 20 million Japanese people that live below the relative poverty threshold. The relative poverty threshold is classified as individuals earning less than 50% of the national median disposable income for Japan. Approximately 44.5%, so slightly under 50%, of single parent households live in relative poverty. And then additionally, Japan, and I read the statistic and it was very interesting. They have the highest single parent employment rate in the world at 86%, yet 44.5%, almost half of the single parents live in relative poverty. So very disconcerting. So I thought it was interesting. On one hand, single parents are employed and employed highly. There's a great employment rate, but they're not making enough money to support themselves and their families. Shifting over to low-income families, over 90% of low-income families have indicated that the growing price inflation has made living much more difficult, leaving less resources to purchase food for their children. What a difficult predicament to be in, not being able to purchase food for your children. Scary, and my heart goes out to anybody that's struggling to provide access to food for themselves and for their children. In schools, around 55% of disadvantaged families state that their children are experiencing food insufficiency. Around 60% of low-income families have had to reduce or completely stop buying core food staples such as rice. That's a core food staple in Japan. Lastly, the national food self-sufficiency rate is currently set at 38%, which on a macroeconomic scale represents 5.5% of the population experiencing moderate to severe food insecurity. So what are the causes of food insecurity? We know what some of the stats are, but what are some of the causes of it? And I utilized an article from the Borgen Project. It's a nonprofit organization, and they highlighted 7 key causes. So interesting. So the first one we'll dig through. Almost 16% of two-parent households and 32% of single-parent households struggle financially to provide enough food for their children. Japan only produces around 40% of the country's overall food demand, so that provides them with the distinction of having the lowest food self-sufficiency ratio among all major developed countries. It also makes them highly reliant on the rest of the world for food. So they're importing 60% of the food for their population. When we compare that to other developed countries like Britain, Britain produces 70% of the food that they consume, and France produces 120% of what their need is for their population. Number three, the traditional diet for Japan is pescatarian. So, what is pescatarian? That's primarily plant-based, vegetables, fruits, whole grains, legumes, nuts, seeds, etc. We'll touch on this towards the end. Okinawa, part of Japan, is also one of the blue zones. So we'll talk about the blue zones and what that means. But what has happened over time is that the diet has slowly started to shift to more of a Western diet, high fat, high protein. So with that shift has also led to a demand for imports. So importing some of the foods that they're not developing or cultivating in Japan. Moving on, there's also a population dichotomy. So you have on two ends of the spectrum, there are concerns of overpopulation. They have an aging population. And then there's also fears of underpopulation. So not having enough children for the next generation. So they're kind of caught in an interesting inflection point right now. Um, Tokyo has around 14 million residents, but Japan's population has decreased by 1 million in the past 5 years, with this aging continuing. The agricultural center for Japan has declined, so it's now only making up about 1% of their overall GDP. Why has that happened? Well, there's a couple factors for that. Japan has grown its tourism economy. Farmers have actually been able to be more profitable by selling or renting their land than developing it, cultivating it, growing it, and making it produce food. Some of the hunger issues in Japan are leading the country to potentially develop land in Africa. So Japan is working with Mozambique and other areas of Africa to build a relationship where Japan could import food from them. There are some concerns that, and this is according to the Journal of Global Initiatives, that this pro-Savannah project could be a form of neo-colonialist economic exploitation of the African people. And then lastly, there are some reports that Japan, and this part made me very sad, wastes or discards up to 18 million tons of food per year. And out of the 18 million tons, between 5 and 8 million tons of that food that's being wasted is actually edible. So why is it being discarded? That's the question I asked. If you could eat it, it's edible, why would you discard it? Small blemishes or visual imperfections was the reason cited. So there's an opportunity there if Japan could reverse some of their food waste, the 5 to 8 million tons of food each year, then they might be able to cut into some of the hunger needs, and that might take away some of their needs for importing as much food. Now, I mentioned Okinawa. Okinawa is one of the regions in the world that's classified as a blue zone. So, a blue zone typically are areas around the world where people have exceptionally long lives. You'll find a lot of people that have lived to be 100 years old called centenarians. And not only are they living a long, healthy life, but they're living a long, healthy life with reduced chronic illness, which is really key. So it's not just about life span, longevity, but quality of life. And I think sometimes we think about things through the lens of how long am I living versus what is the quality of life for the years that I am living. So that's something that's really special about the blue zones. Um, Japan follows a term called akiji, and it translates into a reason to wake up in the morning, essentially having a purpose. So this approach to living and their diet have contributed to being named one of the famous blue zones. So let's review the diet, the specific Blue Zone diet. It's comprised, almost primarily of plant food, 90% of plant food in Okinawa. Um, Fish and other foods such as meat, dairy, and eggs all make up respectively less than 1% of their diet. The diet relies heavily on vegetables and beans, with many of the calories coming from both purple and orange sweet potatoes. I love sweet potatoes, by the way. I think they're great. But it's really interesting that that's such an important part of their diet. And again, this is kind of bifurcated. So Japan and then Okinawa. is a region in Japan. So specifically, this is where they're seeing the longevity of these lifespans and health. Okay. What makes these sweet potatoes so powerful? Well, a couple things. They have anti-inflammatory and antioxidant qualities. So, according to the National Institutes of Health, antioxidants target oxidative stress. Oxidative stress are free radicals that damage our tissues and act as a catalyst for inflammation. These foods also inhibit pathways and enzymes that cause pain, swelling, and redness. So to put a bow around this, specifically the blue zones, there's a couple stats that I wanted to share that I thought were pretty powerful. Um, so individuals that are in Okinawa that are living this lifestyle and eating in this fashion, they are 6 to 12 times have fewer heart disease deaths than in the United States, 2 to 3 times fewer colon cancer deaths than in the United States, 7 times fewer prostate cancer deaths than in the United States, and 5.5 times lower risk of dying from breast cancer than the United States. So a lot of really interesting data points coming out of Okinawa, the blue zone. I had to cover that. I think that was important, and bringing awareness to food insecurity and hunger. A couple quick stats just to leave you with. 1 out of 7 children in Japan live below the relative poverty line. I mentioned that almost 45% of single parent homes live in relative poverty. Over 20% of single parents explicitly report skipping meals or being unable to buy enough food due to financial constraints. 3.4% of the entire population, or roughly 4.2 million, suffer from clinical undernourishment. 5.5% of people encounter moderate to severe food insecurity annually. 7.1% of children under 5 experience stunting caused by prolonged malnutrition. And as I mentioned, 60%, a little bit more than 60% of the food that Japan is consuming is being imported. So that means that they are exposed to supply chain line issues, trade issues. So there's a variety of risks and exposures when, as a company, not a company, a country, but companies too, but as a country, when you're relying upon supply chains and over 60% of the food that you're providing for your population is coming from outside of your country, you become heavily reliant on the global, supply chain. So, really interesting information here. I come back to, if I had one takeaway, was the amount of food waste, and out of the amount of food that's being wasted, the amount that could be repurposed, that's edible, that could be used, it would have a significant impact. The 5 to 8 million tons of food that are edible that are being wasted, not the full 18 million tons, but the 5 to 8 million tons could go a long way to circumventing food insecurity and hunger in Japan. So I hope you enjoyed this episode of the F4 Hunger Awareness Show. We covered hunger and food insecurity in Japan, and our goal is to, with love and compassion, bring awareness to these key fundamental issues and then also provide avenues to help out. So how can you support? You can follow and subscribe to F4 wherever you listen to our podcast. That's really important. Helps us grow our channel and get our message out. And then you can follow and like what we're doing on social media. We also are a nonprofit organization, so we run on donations and the generosity of individuals and organizations that believe in what we're doing. We don't charge for our services. We don't pursue and receive government funding. So we try to remain independent, and our goal is just to serve with love and compassion. So thank you for listening to the F4 Hunger Awareness Show. Don't forget to subscribe and share with your friends. And stay tuned for the next episode of the F4 Hunger Awareness Show, which will be coming up in the near future. Thank you.